Okay, I will start then. Please feel very welcome to this interdisciplinary dialogue on decolonizing academia. We thank you all for your presence and your interest. We want to thank also the Integrative Research Institute on Transformation of Human Environment System, the IRI THESys, to open its disciplinary dialogue, which aim to deal with highly relevant topics for society and discuss them from a multidisciplinary perspective to the key issue of decolonizing academia in this chance. Let me talk briefly about what led us as Decolonizing Research Group at the IRI THESys to build this event and think about these issues of the role of science and in particular of our role as scientists in shaping and contributing to a more just and sustainable future. Many of the issues that are likely to come up today were already raised at the summer school organized by Professor Tobias Krüger in 2019. There, various topics emerged regarding the activist role that we as scientists can play. Depending on the topics we choose to study, the boundaries between activism and science sometimes become blurred. These questions have come up again and again within our institute in various debates, and especially within our decolonial group. Through reference to the phrase decolonizing academia seems sometimes a cliché rather than a long-term real project, since we decolonize so many things from cities, history, culture, or even nature. We still want to refer to academia in those terms. Why? Here, I only want to refer to a few elements, since we hope the question will be further answered during this event. We will not go so much into the debate of the politicization of science, but somehow emphasize its institutional historical context and remember the protected and privileged place of academia. In this way, at least, we can glimpse the forces that influence research programs, urgencies, and junctures, such as today's climate change or the current meta story of the Anthropocene. Important issues, no doubt. However, we want to emphasize the dependency of science from global and local trends and powers that influence the current debates and knowledge process, and also our position as researchers. Today, the terrain of science as a queen of knowledge is being contested by far less rigorous competitors. And we believe that there's more than one scientist who feels the urge to make science great again. With this activity, we want to put a chill on this debate, which so inexorably links scientific knowledge with policy making and decision making. That is why we warn some listeners that we have developed at some points questions to enter into polemical issues. We believe that this is a way of recognizing the positioning of scientists itself, its context, its history, remembering where the modern invention comes from. That science is also changing in its colors. Today is no longer only white, masculine, or Western. This diversity also implies the diversity of views, theories, and narrative that can promote other paths, other interpretation, even other methods. We also slowly began to figure out a way to engage with other epistemologies that have been silenced, not only by science. This is how we can also be demanded, not by science itself, but by the world. It is a demand for creativity and also for commitment. So today, we hope to contribute to removing some of the colonial foundation that keep us safe and secure from a world that seems to be falling apart. Shake up our minds as souls are a bit a call to remember that we are also part of this disaster and that we are called to be part of the solution too. To talk about these issues, we have a wonderful panel today. Two key thinkers on the decolonial topic. Here's Dr. Noa K. She has been acting as scientific director at the Deutsche Zentrum für Integrations- und Migrationsforschung since 2020. From 2018 to 2020, she led the Junior Research Group at the Center for Integration Study at TU Dresden, where her research focused on post-colonial urban research, migrant diasporic politics of commemoration, critical research on integration, and criticism of racism. And we are also with Dr. Antony Pattathu. He is a research fellow at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology and a founding member of the Integrative Center for Global South Study at Tübingen University. His research interests are institutional history of anthropology in Tübingen, transnational religion and migration, with a focus on members of Syro Malabar Church in Kerala in Germany, medical anthropology and Ayurveda in India and Germany, and the colonial theories and methods. We are highly thanks both for their time and disposition to be here with us today. We will start with a brief introductory input from each of around 10 minutes, and then we will pose some questions so they can establish a dialogue. Then we will share a short video contribution from Chile, from the archaeologist Luis Perez about these issues. Then we will have a small break of 5 minutes and reconvene at 2 p.m. And finally, to continue with our discussion. Finally, we will have a Q&A slot open to the public. But first, we want to share with you a poem built and read by our friend and peer Jorge Vega for this occasion as an opening reflection about the role of the researcher.
My name is Jorge Vega. This piece was built thinking about the Nawa Masewa people, and it's dedicated to the Mayan thinker Pedro Uc, and it's called Coyote. First part. Are you a coyote? I was talking with Don Cruz. What do you mean? You know, you come, grab and go. I'm a researcher. Oh, so that's a yes. Isn't that stupid? Who said coyotes aren't smart? They know what they want. They know how to sneak around in the grass. They know how to sleep through unseen. Isn't that smart? But that is mean, don't you think? Coyotes are not mean, nor good, nor evil. They're just coyotes. But they don't relate. They don't care. They have no friends. Isn't that something to cry about? They don't need to relate, nor care. None of its friends have been imprisoned and tortured in jail. None of its friends have been by the paramilitary raped, forcing its best friend to watch. Because it has no friends. It needs no friends. It can go back in calm and sleep in peace in its warm, cozy bunker. It doesn't matter if roosters and hens cry their chickens to wind in the cold. So I'll ask you again, are you a coyote or not? Those were the last words Don Cruz said before the military took him away. Second part. But let's not talk about pain, said the hunter to the prey. It's so stressful. Aren't we all beautiful under the blue light sky, just floating slave feathers in the secret perfect order of the wind of things? I definitely agree. Isn't this a mess already? Just hold me tight and close to you, so I can feel fresh and warm your bread beneath the foot and rest in peace as it should be. Amen. Sounds of music. You think you're on the control. I think you're crazy. You're just one fire away from him, from it, again, again, and again. Fourth and last. I don't agree with your description. Come on, man. That's just exaggerating. You treat researchers as Pol Pot. Not all researchers, not all men. I want to comment on your perception, if I may. Distorted of reality, if I may. Yeah, sure. Just drop me a line. I'll answer you as soon as I clean the blood in my face, my shirt, my shoes. I'm so grateful. You're so generous. You're so kind just to listen. I'll tell the neo-Nazi harassing my children at the bus. Maybe we can sit down together and talk and have a cup of tea. Dear Mr., dear Mrs., thanks again for your explanation of my life, of my experience. That was quite revealing, quite impressive. Yours, but not yours, the one on the other side. P.S. This is not about you anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Oof. Now, after this very strong input, we will ask Dr. Pattathu to start to share with us his opening input. And after him, we will listen to Dr. Noa. Please, Dr. Antony Pattathu, the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you, first of all, for that wonderful poem and the invitation, and the whole team for organizing this. And I think there's a lot in the poem that we could already talk about in relations to decolonizing, but I'm just going to give you some first insights to the questions that have been raised to me, and talk a little bit about like how I came to do decolonial work. And it's really nice for me when I got the invitation, because when I started to do work on decolonizing anthropology in particular, but also decolonizing academia, I did a little workshop in 2018 with just a couple of people at the University of Tübingen. And it's become a really widespread focus now. I mean, there's no way around decolonizing anymore. And I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, it's also a problem because it has become a negative foil for right-wing populist movements like the AfD, claiming that like the ideological underpinnings of decolonizing are a threat to the society, a threat to the museums. So in my impulse today, I want to really think about what does it mean to decolonize academia, and what does it mean to do decolonial work, and think about the colonial logics that are at work actually. So for me, the starting point to engage with that was actually post-colonial theory as an anthropologist and religious studies student. And of course, it was connected to my own experience as continuously racialized cis Indian German person. And my later engagement came actually with the student movements in Oxford, and first in South Africa, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the Fees Must Fall movement. I really started to look into these campaigns and the demands of the students, like why is my curriculum so wide in the UK, and other movements that were really an inspiration for me. And I think that's also part of the hegemony that we have in academia, because on the one hand, we have all the big shots that we know about. And for my discipline, Faye Harrison has to be definitely mentioned. She wrote a book, Decolonizing Anthropology, almost 20 years ago, addressing a lot of the questions that come up now. And of course, also like indigenous studies scholars like Linda Toohey-Wyer-Smith were actually the people who really gave us some of the key things that we are thinking about today. So for me, that was the starting point, the student movements, but then also going back to these works and seeing what's coming out nowadays. And at the same time, I have to say that decolonial work can never be done without having allies, without having a group, without working as a collective or collaboratively. And that's part of what I'm doing at my department, but also with people from the Fire River Collective. And I'm part of that, where we try to work about particularly race and emotions in the classroom. But first things first. So when I think about colonial logic, that starts with the history of the university, that starts with the history of my own department. So the knowledge production actually is coming out of the colonial time, and it's kind of persisting within our canons, curriculums, and classrooms. And fundamentally, the current forms of diversity are actually part of the product of the colonial ties that Germany had with several countries. And the establishment of the discipline of anthropology is basically born out of the cradle of colonialism. And the discussions that we are having right now are still trying to cope with this. And often people in the discipline say, oh, we addressed this already in the writing culture debate, but still that kind of colonial logic prevails. And the current practices and methods that we are having in the global academic landscape cannot be seen free from this history of coloniality. So the critical thinking and analyzing actually hasn't led to major shifts in the discipline. And it's a very slow and arduous process. It is also an internalized logic that becomes part of the knowledge production. It's an economy that's tied to the intellectual division of labor between the global north and the global south. And that's something that we are trying to overcome, for example, in the work that we're doing at the Interdisciplinary Center for Global South Studies, through financially sustained cooperations and collaborations. But at the same time, like the structures, the bureaucracies restrict us and really engaging in these processes. So it's always working with and against the structures that we are in. And I think that was really nicely pointed out in the introduction. At the same time, it's important for me to mention that not everything is colonial, but we rather need to look closely when colonial logics are at work. So in my understanding, decolonizing approaches address these logics locally and globally, and look into the hegemonic long-term effects of colonialism in regards to material conditions, but also in regards to established epistemologies and who can actually bring certain epistemologies into play. Well, Ventura de Sousa Santos, for example, argued about the episteme-sites, which are like part of the cognitive empire. The question that arises for me in this regard to decolonizing academia is very much connected to the question of positionalities and identities that lie hidden in the concept of decolonizing, because the emancipation process associated with decolonial work are dependent on these positionalities and on these identities. And here I want to go a little bit into the theoretical background of postcolonial and decolonial debates. So, for example, if we look into these two schools which really influence the theoretical discussions that we're having in regards to decolonial work and decolonizing academia, on the one hand, we have, and I have to excuse myself because in the short time it's a very schematical sketch, we have the Colonidad Modernidad group around in the Latin American context, with Aníbal Cañano and the colonial metrics of power, and Walter Mignolo and others, but we shouldn't also read them without the critiques that are there by Silvia Rivera, Cuscanchi, in their understanding of what coloniality means. It's basically the precursor to modernity. And of course, modernity as a concept has to be also critically analyzed. And it's irretrievably linked, the modernity that we're speaking about today, to colonialism, racism, and of course global capitalism. So here begins the confrontation begins basically from the first moment of the colonial encounters with the settlement in the Americas, the concept of building the nation state, and that is absolutely connected to the colonial history that we have. And it goes along with the objectification of populations, and we can see this very much in our own context, in the European context, and that's been nicely also analyzed by Fatima El-Tayeb in her concept of European others, like where these categorization come from, and they have colonial ties and colonial narratives to them. So in contrast, the post-colonial approaches evolve with a focus on South Asia and the Middle East, and everybody knows the key thinkers from the 19th and 20th century that they are addressing mainly through literary studies. And I'm calling, of course, about Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Homi Bhabha. The argument about theory building runs through literature and language and thus tries to break through Eurocentric narratives. I see this work as a building block and complementary to what is addressed in decolonial approaches. Much overlaps, and yet decolonial approaches often go beyond the post-colonial by asking how colonial epistemology affects the ontologies, the being of today, in which we operate, and by making clear calls for action that are directed especially at academia, but also are thought out in much more harsh environments than academia. And we see that with the cases of all the student movements that we had, all the colonial resistance movements that we had. And that means to scrutinize what decolonizing means, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Young have done in their work, saying that decolonizing actually is not a metaphor. So this means that we really need to look into the local context where colonial relations are still at place, or where the remnants of colonial relations are visible in the logics of our canons, classrooms, and curriculums. So I think to think about colonial logics, it's really, really good to look into some of the forethinkers. And one of the concepts that I want to share with you that some of you might already know is the idea of the cultural bomb by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his book Decolonizing the Mind. And he says the effect of the cultural bomb is basically to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in the heritage of struggle, in the unity, in their capacities, and ultimately themselves. So in this quote, Thiong'o basically describes how the colonial logic is at place and how we need to address this, the annihilation of any kind of positive identity and positionality. So these two aspects are questions that are more relevant than ever. And if we want to talk about decolonizing academia, whatever kind of discipline we are looking at or we are involved in, this is quintessential. So it can only be done critically questioning our positionalities as scholars and the appeal to decolonization. In what light should decolonization of academia actually take place, particularly if we are speaking from majoritarian white universities in Germany. So the debate I'm predominantly engaged in revolves around decolonizing my own discipline of social and cultural anthropology. So this is where I begin in teaching decolonial approaches in seminars and transforming the canon and the curriculum I teach. At the same time, I'm dedicated to the local history of anthropology and its colonial roots, so that actually an unlearning of colonial logics can take place within our disciplines and our classrooms and canons. And it can only be a collaborative process, which we need to face also, particularly on an emotional level, looking into the complicities that are continuously perpetuated in the academy, so that finally we can actually change some of the structures that enable us or restrict the interventions that we want to take if we are talking about decolonizing academia. And I think I'll leave it with that for the beginning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pattathu. Let us now listen to Dr. Noa. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Antony, for broadening it up and also to engage also with the difference between post-colonial and decolonial theory. I think we will talk about that later. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, for the warm introduction, and also to kind of kick off with a poem, which is a very unusual start into any conversation. So I really like that. I also would like to start from where did I start to engage with decolonial thinking, decolonization. For the background, I'm trained in planning. I did study landscape planning, and I did my PhD in architecture. And so my interest, and also beside my studies, I was working in or active in anti-racist movements, self-organized migrant diasporic movements. And so when I was in my studies, nobody was teaching me anything about race and racism. Well, I have this kind of daily encounter, which I think is quite typical, the ongoing question where I'm from. And I was like, well, I'm born in Germany. I'm just coming through the door. I don't understand what the question actually is about. And so through my studies and also engaging with architecture and planning, which I do think is a study to establish power relations and put people into their places. So this is really about the kind of power knowledge. And so nobody was talking about it. So I took the dissertation and my PhD to dig into what actually is racism about and what has racism to do with urban politics, urban representation. So I was looking at street vending practices, and in particular on street vending, because this is actually imaginized or put into place to megacities. And megacities is what we do understand in urban studies as the cities of the global south. So also questioning why is there a divide between metropolitan studies and megacities and megacity studies. And I was very much inspired by the work of Ananya Roy. And I was kind of taking something which you might consider as informal economy, typical of, you may call it third world, underdeveloped, and so on, and take it to the north and study it in the north. So that's where I started to look at, on one hand, racism, but also what are the concepts in urban studies to understand what we're doing. And from there, engaging also with post-colonial theory. But to me, it didn't help me to think through how are resources distributed? What is the material component of coloniality if I do understand the city and urban living as systems of infrastructure, a system of resources? And therefore, Quijano's coloniality of power was very helpful to think through and engage with decolonial thinking. And so also in that time, so it's almost 10 years ago, we did the conference Decolonize the City at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and a book came out. It's this one, Decolonize the City, zur Kolonialität der Stadt, Gespräche, Aushandlung, Perspektiven. It's in German, but actually we did publish this as a collective, and next year is 10 years after the conference. We're really thinking about it to publish, to translate it into English and Spanish. Because we see, and people are asking, where is the book in different languages? So I've been watching decolonial debates in Germany, so over almost a decade, and you can see it became very prominent. And I think, and there are three questions which we might discuss later also, we have to look at, on first hand, what kind of academia. Antony was framing out and giving some insight in particular to anthropology. Then also I think the question is from where to decolonize. And there are different positionalities to the question. Is it within the peripheries of modern Western countries or societies, but also in a global perspective? Because I feel very uncomfortable that in the last decade, the term of decolonization was very much inhabited by Western academic infrastructure, and not because you could ask, What's about the anti-colonial knowledge production we had in the 60s and 70s? Where's all this knowledge gone? Why is it not part of our prolific scientific knowledge production? So where are the gaps is, on the other hand, the question. And then the third question, where it becomes very concrete, is what does decolonization include? I think that's a huge question. I think we don't find the answer here in this session. What I also like to, and just to, I think it's, to me, these are the three main questions to move along. What I also would like to lay out is there is also a map of coloniality and different historiographies of colonialism, which you could also see in the theoretical reflection by postcolonial studies, which is actually a reflection of the experience of the British Empire, whereas decolonial thinking is a reflection upon European, South European, monarchistic, colonial endeavors. So there is a difference whether you experience 500 years of colonialism or you experienced colonialism as a nation state building project. And so there are different access to colonialism. And what I think is very important, to also differentiate between the settler colonial context, and there are different degrees of settler colonialism, but also to address, and that's why I'm so interested into Europe, to address metropolitan colonialism, as I call it, because it seems to us in Europe, we are the modern enlightened continent. Racism, colonialism happened somewhere else. And that's also what the work of Fatima El-Tayeb is very important, to displace not only racial thinking out of Europe, but also to displace history out of Europe. And it's insofar important because I think one of the huge legacies of colonialism is the axis of the racial axis, as Quijano was calling it, and the question of racism. And racism insofar was a colonial metrics to count people and to objectify people and to dehumanize. And that becomes very important because now since last year, I think most of you have witnessed that in Europe, we had the Black Lives Matter movements, we had the murderers in Hanau, in Halle, and also up to the government, they were saying we have to do something against racism. So it became a relevant problem in Germany. And so where I'm working at DeZIM Institute, which is a state-funded research institute. So it's under the, it's funded by the Ministry of Family Affairs. So it's a bit different to university knowledge production. And we received you say in German, Auftrag, the demand. So you have to do something, and it's to set up a monitoring on racism. And so we are running into the question, how to do this if you want to do quantitative empirical social research. And then you have to really look into the structures of knowledge production and how these two histories of colonial knowledge production, but also modern colonial production. And that's where I can see it, how it's intersecting and why is it's important to reflect to each other. And within this project, on one hand, being driven by the motivation to do evidence-based research, on the other hand, to reflect upon how to work against the logics of objectification. So I think also one of the questions in decolonization, is it possible, for example, as an academic of color, to subjectify myself, to become a subject with an academic knowledge production, which I think is it's a huge challenge. And we could look at the US, you could look at the aftermath of civil rights movements, because the civil rights movements were leading to new studies, Chicana studies, Black studies, Asian studies. And it was about that people said, our history is not part of the knowledge system. Now we're some decades later, but you also see that these kind of partitions into different studies might not transform the whole academic knowledge production system. So this is something where we, I think, in Europe are way behind, but this gives us an opportunity to look what happens in other areas of the world. And I think it's to think through decolonization, we have to engage with anti-colonial knowledge production, because there have been a lot of stuff going on to think through the academic system in different terms, because it's not anthropology being a legacy of colonialism. Geography is a legacy of colonialism. If you look at medicine, I mean, now in the epidemic, and if you look at the history of Virchow, like the main or the very prominent medicine research, we also know that there are human skeletons which came from the German colonial, from the German colonies, are still in Berlin. Human remains are still in Berlin, and they're not given back due to scientific reason. So all this kind of knowledge production is enmeshed with the question, or enmeshed with the process of dehumanization, and it's still part of what we know, and it's so normalized. And that, I think, it's such a huge challenge to go against the grains and work against this normalization through academic knowledge production. But it's also in biology and so on. So I think there are different fields where you can track colonial legacies, but it's not visible. And to track these legacies and to claim them as problematic, because the question of modernity and coloniality are stick together, that I think it's also an analytical approach which decolonial analysis gave us. I think I spoke already quite long, so I leave it here because I'm also very interested in the conversation we're having. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noa, and both of you of your contribution. Thank you. Now we will start with the question we have prepared. So we will start the dialogue. The people which are presented, please be patient for you can sing your comment and your question. The final 20 minutes, we will have the Q&A slot, so you can make all the questions you have. So please be patient. Now I want to go to our first question, which is maybe it will sound a little bit naive to some listeners, but to have a shared common ground of understanding what this means to or what it actually means to decolonize academia. Now, if the colonial era is supposedly over, now you have both have talking about this historical dimension. Why continue to speak about colonial dynamics or structures? If academia is an epistemological and not political enterprise, then why to talk about decolonizing academia? Can you build on that, Dr. Pattathu? Please.
Yeah, sure. And also thanks to Noa. I think it was a great compliment, and I think you really raised some of the key points that are lying underneath it, and particularly talking about race and racism. And the question that you just posed basically is pointing a little bit into this direction, because it's really the question from where we are speaking or who is speaking. And I just want to share a short experience that I had, because I'm also doing anti-racist work with a lot of NGOs, and one of the experience that I had kind of like point to the problem that we have if we talk about these, why are we still talking about colonialism? So I was giving a seminar about post-colonial theory and global South thinking with a group of people who are like actually from migrant organizations, and there was a kind of training program for them. And I was introducing the people I was talking about earlier a little bit, and the reaction of the people, like some of them descendants of formerly colonized, some of them descendants of former colonizers, was like talking about what coloniality actually means to them, or colonialism. And some said, like, for me, colonialism never ended. And others said, like, for me, it doesn't have to do anything with my everyday life. Why should I talk about colonialism? It's gone, it's history, right? So, and because you were asking about the political dimensions and the question that are related to that, I think it's really important to see this on a broader scope of how academia works. And I mean, academia doesn't understand itself as a political enterprise, but of course, everything that we have, everything that we're doing as academics is inscribed into a certain political field, or it kind of has a political impact. And I think it's really important that we understand this, and that we really see how this plays out, particularly when we are talking about decolonizing, because it can become an empty metaphor, as Tuck and Yang have said. And that's actually what happened in a lot of places, and what also Noa was pointing to, the gap that we have from anti-colonial knowledge to decolonization. Where did it go? Because one of the things in this kind of like politicizing, depoliticizing process that we have when we're talking about decolonizing academia is actually the translation that takes place. And that has to do with a lot of different factors of who is actually in the power centers of academia, who can actually speak about forms of knowledge and bring them to the fore, whose history is heard. And I think that are some of the like access points that we really need to understand, which are quintessentially also connected to the racialization of knowledge forms, and the kind of value that is given to racialized forms of knowledge and other forms of knowledge. So maybe that's just for a start.
Thank you very much. Dr. Noa, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I would like to comment insofar, I mean, the question as such reflects that we have so different approaches to the meaning whether the colonialism ended or not. It seems mainstream Europe thinks it's over. But as Antony was saying, also there are many people in Europe who say it's not over, because I do experience colonial logics and so on a daily basis. And I'm also very much engaging with memory politics, and also with all these post-colonial questions, and also coming from urban studies. I'm also engaging with why did Berlin decide to build a castle and to call it Humboldt Forum, why to bring the ethnological collection into the middle of the city, and why is this kind of the main representation of a new reunified German nation. And so what I see, what not did happen, that Europe as such as a continent and the European nations didn't broke with their colonial past, that they didn't said, and they didn't made up a consensus to say we did something wrong. There are a lot of colonial injustices. So if you look at memory politics around the question of enslavement, we don't know yet how many people were enslaved. It's not part of our daily main memory knowledge. There are some very small places like in Amsterdam and also in Nantes where something is going on, and also in, I think in UK the question, the discussion is a little bit more vivid. But if you look at that line, you see that this question of colonial violence, colonial injustices, the question of genocide. We just had the discussion here in Germany about the German nation going to Namibia, and the whole process is under discussion whether it's possible to do some kind of reparation or not. And because it's not so clear, and that's where I want to get back, that Antony said also in his introduction, that the right wing is kind of attacking decolonization, but on the other hand, they're kind of circulating a revanchist approach to colonialism in ways that colonialism wasn't bad. It was bringing the civilization mission, the infrastructures, and so on. So the whole also more moral implications, how we do think of colonialism, is contested. And to decolonize means to contest that the morality of a good colonialism is attacked. And that's why we're having all these social discussions. And I think if we come back to the question of academia and also the responsibility, that's where academia can contribute to show and also to discuss what is injustice, what are the facts, what happened, and to bring that into the picture. I don't say it's easy. I mean, we're talking about a long history, and there are a lot of implications, and it's no easy side where anybody is standing. I mean, I consider myself as a metropolitan person of color, living in a diaspora, but very privileged. I have German citizenship and so on. I can almost travel freely, whereas other people can't travel freely. And I mean, all this discussion, you will see how that's reflect in international cooperation within academia, who can cooperate, who not, who has access to libraries, and so on. But this I wanted to add to the question, how does Europe engage with this colonial unjust history?
Thank you very much, Dr. Noa. And focus now on the question about methodologies and how to apply. When we talk about decolonizing the academy, are we only talking about an issue of inclusion? For example, when gender quotas are demanded, would it be enough to update ethical research protocols to be more inclusive or colonial or post-colonial or excluded subject? What do you think about Dr. Pattathu? Would you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that comes up very often, and I think I want to just reiterate what actually the people in the Rhodes Must Fall movement have said. They said, like, they were standing outside of the Oriel College with pictures in their hand, and their mouth was taped, and they said, "Don't diversify, decolonize." And I think it's really important that if we think about this, it is not something that has to be thought of only in regards to diversification. That's not the point. It's really about how the colonial history has created the places where we are at in the society within Europe, being European others, being non-white people, and so on, and really understand these power dynamics at play. That's what I would say to that. And I mean, like, the discussion about quotas is actually, it's important from the historical perspective. And at the same time, I think there is a thing where you really need to think about the aspects of what are the political implication of those quotas. And I mean, we are far away from what we are having in the UK, for example, particularly if you look at the last racism report by the Johnson government. I mean, it's exactly doing what Noa has just mentioned. It's kind of like really talking about the good sides of colonialism and the empire. So so we need to be really careful in this discussion, but it's also, if we think about decolonizing, I think it's also about really showing the invisible quotas that we have in some regards. And that's something that Emilia Roig pointed out, where she said, like, it's really interesting to think about, if we're talking about quotas, to think about the way that, like, who are the people in power, right? And we are not thinking from the minoritarian position, but thinking from the majoritarian position, and then bring a decolonial perspective to the aspect of the question of who do we really want to be as a society. And that has to do, like, for example, also if you take it to other examples, like, you know, renaming streets. And I'm always asking myself, who do we want to be as a society, and who has a say in that? So I think it's important to have these discussions, and I'm pretty sure that these discussions will come at some point in Germany, and they are necessary, but it's always a very twisted logic that takes place, particularly in regards to that moral economy of how we think about the history and what that says about people, and what that also means in regards to what Noa has said before, like, what does it mean to become a subject even as a POC academic? Because the moment we are talking about these quotas, this is the next debate that will play into it, to discredit people who will be achieving positionalities due to quotas and so on. So this is always the kind of like political sphere that you are in. And I think we really have to work through the colonial logics to say that actually the way society is structured right now is a product of these colonial logics. But it has to be differentiated on many levels to make a clear claim about this. And then the next step is the political implication, of course.
Thank you very much. Dr. Anu.
That's a huge question, and I think the short question, if decolonization is about include, let's say, specific people, I don't think that's decolonization. That's, to be a bit polemic, I think it's more like make up decolonization, because you focus on some people. But I think what it's interesting, on one hand, we need to look at the ethics of research. How do we research? Because there's a large field of communities in the global south who had like biological knowledge, and it was stealed and robbed, and it's now inverted into economic circles. So what kind of code of conduct do we have that this is not happening? This is one side. Then on the other hand, also to look at the architecture of academic knowledge production. We have all these faculties, these disciplines, but if you're really interested to work interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, how is it possible to follow up a career? How is it possible to deliver questions? And on the other hand, when I'm looking to all the knowledge out of academia we do have in regard to climate change, but still seems to be contested from politics. So we also have to ask ourselves, how is this coming together? So there are many layers to the question how we can think through decolonization. And I think one aspect I also want to add, it's not just only about the people within, but also the philosophies we don't see, and the whole cosmologies. How do we understand ourselves as subjects within cosmology around, and so on, and to conceptualize also the ways how we do conceptualize knowledge. Yeah. I leave it here.
Thank you very much, both of you.
Maybe.
Sorry.
Maybe I could add a little bit to that, because I mean, like when you were mentioning the quotas, I was kind of adding to this, but just from a perspective of social and cultural anthropology, I mean, it really has also to do with the attitude how research is done. And for example, at our department, like since we started working on decolonizing, we really tried to implement the decolonial ideas into our research ethics. And that means to really think about your positionality before you start to do any kind of research in regards to where you're coming from, that you are from a privileged university in Germany. And if you are building up relationships with people in another country to live with them, to do anthropological research, it's also your responsibility to keep these relations intact and don't fall into that extractivist pit, basically. So it really has a huge responsibility even for our students, and we try to integrate that into the ethical research guidelines that we are having. And I mean, that's for the bigger part of decolonizing academia. It means that academia needs to strive for different ethics of accountability in regards to what different disciplines are doing, just to add to that.
Oh, thank you. I think the question about the implication of scientists lead us to the video we want to share with you. No, it's a contribution about the role of scientists on the ground as facilitators of economic and political projects. In this case, of extractivist mining projects in indigenous territories, coming from some cases in Latin America. Here is, we will share with you the voice of the archaeologist Luis Perez, who has been working hand in hand with indigenous community in Chile. We will comment on this.
Al final lo que se define es que los grupos de profesionales asisten o van a los territorios a intervenir o a los lugares a intervenir y levantan información nomás, desde su propia perspectiva. Y no existe, por lo tanto, una interlocución o una interpretación con las comunidades indígenas. Lo que sí hay muchas veces es una recogida de datos. Y la recogida de datos son reinterpretaciones, pero yo creo que bajo ninguna perspectiva son interlocuciones o interpretaciones directas. No existe eso. Siempre son desde la academia, desde una perspectiva que podría tener siempre una tendencia positivista, y que es muy ligada a lo tangible. Lo intangible prácticamente no se ve como una dimensión a estudiar profundamente dentro de las líneas de base ambientales. ¿Por qué lo digo? Porque, mira, es como un absurdo cuando tú ves los estudios de base ambiental. Los profesionales van un par de semanas o un par de meses al territorio, levantan información respecto de, por ejemplo, patrimonio intangible, y lo que logran recabar lo indican en los informes. Hay un caso, en el caso de Cerro Colorado, para el proyecto de expansión, que los profesionales van a terreno, por ejemplo, al IRIMA, y no ven a la comunidad haciendo actividades, y en sus informes referencian que la comunidad ya no hace actividades. Y el Estado valida a estos, entre comillas, interlocutores cuando no lo son. En el caso del IRIMA, por ejemplo, uno que los conoce, ellos, por ejemplo, no hacen sus actividades, no van como otras comunidades al cerro a hacer manifestaciones así explícitas de sus costumbres. Hay costumbres que solo se manejan a veces en el plano mental. Hay costumbres calendarizadas, pero que pueden correrse de fecha o se pueden posponer. Hay costumbres, por ejemplo, que tienen que ver con el equilibrio ecológico, que muchas veces no son grandes expresiones ni manifestaciones, como te digo, a veces son pequeños gestos que tiene la persona. Y eso muchas veces los profesionales no lo logran percibir. Esa es la primera capa de problemas que generalmente tenemos en esta validación de proyectos cuando recogen información territorial. Es lo que le llaman la investigación del medio humano, técnicamente. En la ley de bases de medio ambiente en Chile se le llama el medio humano. Y después tú vas profundizando en las capas de los problemas de estas conductas que son de dominación, en resumen. Porque al final es como que hay un gesto de considerar a las comunidades, pero ese gesto no es completo, no es vinculante y no es desde la perspectiva de las comunidades. Las comunidades muchas veces, si partiéramos de la base de una consulta previa, libre e informada, por ejemplo, como lo establece el Convenio 169, ni siquiera en muchos casos se enfrentarían a una cantidad gigantesca de proyectos de intervención que hay, que no son de interés ni nacen de la comunidad, sino que son de terceros, de empresarios, de particulares, y al final la comunidad se enfrenta prácticamente como un inquilino al que se le toma el parecer. Y digo un inquilino porque el Estado de Chile prácticamente se considera el dueño de las tierras, les valida los títulos de dominio de periodo peruano colonial, y el resto de la tierra es del Estado, y por lo tanto es como consultar por cumplir con protocolos solamente. Pero no llega a consultar, por ejemplo, a principio de año, a la comunidad, qué proyectos tienen, qué orientación tienen anual para el desarrollo, cuál es su idea de desarrollo a futuro. Y, por ejemplo, llegar a una instancia en que tú dices, pucha, ¿sabes qué? No consideran proyectos mineros a lo mejor. Entonces, ¿para qué te vas a tomar la molestia de someter a la comunidad a estas tensiones constantes durante años, cada vez que viene un particular a querer intervenir sobre sus formas de desarrollo tradicionales?
Well, I hope you have seen the subtitles for those who do not speak Spanish. As we saw in the video, academics in this very specific case and the implementation of extractive projects in Latin America, especially in Chile, academics can be captured by external agendas. And to continue now with this dialogue, do you think that academia as an institution can overcome the pressures of those powers like governmental or economic actors that influence the research agendas through research funding, for example? Or how to build a kind of roadmap that help us to overcome these entanglements? What do you think about this, Dr. Pattathu? Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very difficult case. I mean, because depending on where you are positioned as a researcher and then intervening, thinking about like the role of the government and what you're doing as a researcher, it is in that regard, I think, very restricted, also depending on the guidelines of the institution from which you're coming. So that's part of a kind of like politics that is there in the university. And I mean, if I look at my own research, if I look at the research that we can do as representatives of the universities and as academics, there are very clear guidelines that you are not allowed to basically intervene, or they are also part of the ethical guidelines, that it is also a question of how much you can really engage in certain restrictions or interventions between government and local people, as we've just seen in the video. So I think that really depends on the locality where you're at, so that you really understand like what are the forms of intervention that you can take, and what are the ways of how you can, for example, create reciprocity or even help the people that you are living and working with. So there is no simple answer to that, or no general answer, and it really depends on where you are and from where you are acting.
Yeah, thanks you. Dr. Noa, what do you think about this?
I would take up what Antony say, and also think the question is not about the academia, because the academia is not one house and we live in it and we just think through, because it's also the question, who is funding what kind of academia? I mean, universities in Germany are mostly tax funded. So there are some principles bound to that kind of money, because it's also principle of the nation state. So that's one vein how funding comes in, but it's not the only tax-funded research we have. It could be also community-led funded research, but also what we see is that there are a huge amount of economic-driven business money going into research, and behind that, behind the different fundings, you have also a different interest. What is the outcome of academic knowledge? So I think that is important to look at if we do want to decolonize academia, that academia as such is not a one-dimensional entity which we can just to turn around and do this, but we also have to look and track on one hand where the funding is coming on, what are the responsibilities, and how we can act upon it. Because on one hand you can be very critical about tax-funded government, but on the other hand, if you look, you have a government, in particular in Germany, it's a democratic government, you can hold that kind of government accountable. I mean, there are also universities who say we shouldn't do research into military because that's research shouldn't do. So you can act upon principles. But if money is not also not monitored as tax funded, then it also becomes very complicated. And I think we need to be aware that academia is funded through very different channels. And so one question could also be, how could academia look like when it might be community-led, but then what is the entity of that community? And I think that's a very specific question if you look at academic knowledge production in settler colonial context. But this is a total different context which you cannot transfer to Europe. So if we think through decolonization within European context, the question of community is a total different one in comparison to settler colonial context.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you both for this wonderful discussion. As you maybe have realized, we don't make the pause because of the time, so sorry about that. But we will now open the floor for the Q&A slot. So so we enter a round of question and answer. I will gather some of those that are already in the chat. And please raise your hand if you have any question or comment for our speakers. The floor is open.